Welcome to Casual DIY channel. In today's video, I will be progressing with my project, the router table attachment for my table saw Rage 5S. In today's episode, we'll be making a router lift. Check out the video. If you haven't seen my last video on actually making this router attachment for the table saw, I'm gonna drop a link down below in the description of the video. So a couple of steps back, I'm actually making the plastic plate that is attached to the aluminium router plate. As you can see, I'm just retracing a few steps from my last video so you know what I'm doing. I'm using the furniture hex drive nuts fittings to attach the router to the plastic plate and then the plastic plate to the aluminium plate. Now I need to remove the springs from my router so the router lift would actually work correctly without additional stress on it. Okay, so the key element of this build is actually we're going to be using the fittings that are on the router. It's a plunge router, and in my case I've got 4 screws at the top, and basically we'll attach our jig to those fittings. For this jig I'm using 12mm plywood. I need 4 pieces in total, and 2 smaller pieces that will go on the bottom of the router, and obviously 2 pieces that will go on the side of the router. I'm just gluing them together using some brads just to hold it in place as the glue dries. I'm also cutting 2 thin strips of 12mm plywood. This will serve as a spacer between the jig and the router, so we've got some airflow so our router will not get too hot. Later on I'm gonna pre-drill a couple of holes in that plywood that goes on top, just to make sure that there is enough airflow around the motor of this router. I'm just using some bolts, attaching the 2 strips to the router, and as you can see it's a solid connection here. Now it's time to put everything together. We need to be sure that everything fits correctly and tightly, so I'm pre-drilling some holes now through the spaces as well, so I can drive some screws through it. So we are in the exact position, and the bolts later on can be positioned and attached to the router, so I don't have any calculations and any mishaps. To make sure everything aligns correctly, I'm pre-drilling the existing holes through which the bolts went through to the router, and on the other side where the sandwich plywood is, I'm using, I believe, a 10mm bit just to enlarge the holes so I've got access to the bolts. It's all holding as it should. Now it's time for the side piece to be mounted onto the existing plywood piece. I'm just going to be using some glue and a lot of screws. As mentioned before, I'm pre-drilling some holes to make sure the airflow is sufficient. Now I'm cutting a block out of ash. I'm using it for attaching a hex coupling nut that will serve as a guide for our metal rod that will go inside. I need exactly a 13mm bit to pre-drill the hole for it, and the only bit I had was for drilling in metal, but hey, it did the job. Now I'm pre-drilling 6 holes to be able to screw this onto the L-shaped plywood that we did already. To make sure that steel hex coupling nut is steady enough in that block of wood, I'm actually using 5-minute epoxy, and I think that will be sufficient in this case. Now I'm using my Dremel to cut the threaded bar to the correct length. At one of the ends of the rod I'm actually making a cut so it's deep enough that it can take a screwdriver. So for this project I'm using pillow block bearings. Super simple to use, really convenient in this case. It will guide the threaded rod where it needs to go. We're going to use two. One will attach to the plastic base. And at that point, we're going to use the fittings that are on the block bearing to actually secure the threaded rod so it will remain in one place. And the bearing that's located at the bottom of the jig, that will remain open. Now we need to make sure that the block is absolutely straight on the 90 degrees to the base, and we screw it on. The bearing is attached to the jig. To attach the block bearing at the base, I'm just pre-drilling it and using the fittings I used before. First test to see if it works, and it seems to be working just fine. Now I'm pre-drilling the aluminium plate and doing a countersink so we've got a nice finish at the top. And as I mentioned before, the block bearing at the top near the plate that needs to be locked. And more or less that's it. And it seems to be working just fine. But we need to test it to know exactly if there's any issues with it. If you watched my first video on making the box, you know that I made a measurement mistake and the box is too small to actually take the router lift. So I need to make some adjustments. I'm just cutting a hole in the bottom to take the jig. Let's see if it fits. Perfect. Fits like a glove. Okay, so let's play around with it, see if it works in the position that it needs to be. At the minute I am seeing no issues. So with a screwdriver or with a drill, it works just fine. Right then, moment of truth. Is it straight? Absolutely bob on. 90 degrees to the tabletop. Spot on. How about the adjustments? Can we make micro adjustments on it? I think we do. In my case, there's no issues with that. So I've set up the router height and let's do some cutting. Definitely need to come up with some better dust extraction for this router attachment. And there you have it, guys, a fairly simple router lift that actually works, which I'm really pleased about. It's definitely not a perfect solution for every single scenario. Now, obviously the support is only from one side of the router, and at the minute it works fine. There's no issues. As you've seen the bit, it's at 90 degrees to the table, which is very important. But I can imagine over time, the plywood, the L shape that we did, that may give a too much of a flex. So I'm thinking converting that into a U shape and have another bar at the front of it as well to give that extra stability. As I say, at the minute, it's actually working fine. If I will have some issues with it in the future, I will amend the design. But you can be assured I will let you know about it and I'll take you on that project with me as well. But for now, what I've got stays as it seems to be working just fine. I've actually done a few tests with it. I've run some materials through it just to see how it performs. And my router actually has a lock. So if you lock it, it will not go up and down. And I've actually tried to use this router lift without locking the router. And unfortunately, after a few passes, it actually went down. So that means due to vibrations, the router lift on its own will go down. Hence, in this case, I need to use the stop that's actually with the router. It's actually not a big deal. It's not a problem because it is in a convenient space for me to reach and just lock it. But I can imagine some of the Plunge routers may be quite awkward in this position to do that. So maybe a revised version of this will happen in the future, where I will add some sort of a lock-in mechanism to that, but time will tell. Now, this is not the end of this particular project. There will be a third video where I'm going to be doing some storage solutions for this space, plus additional dust extraction inside of the box to help catch as much dust as possible when routing materials. So remember, if you're not a subscriber and you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the third part of this build. That's it for today's video, but don't forget about part 3 that will come out next week. For now, that's all. Take care.